10. Dan's letter of confession. The lake was a vast expanse of darkness, and from it came a cool breeze which found its way to the veranda of Club Majolo, where several people were standing, holding tall glasses of beer or sherry. The reception was a success that evening. "You can't compare it to the one we had last night," thought Dr. Dan Moyo, sipping his drink quietly. Yesterday's do was too rigid, full of pomp and red tape. The men were in dinner jackets and the ladies in glittering evening wear that must have cost lots of money, just about the price of a dozen bags of maize grain. You would think Africa's Paris, Abidjan, was just a mile away. And, man, every time the master of ceremonies introduced an official from the Ministry of Health, the guests would all stand up and clap hands. Yesterday was hell. To make matters worse, the night before, Dan had tried to get in touch with his wife, in vain. Later, the telephone operator had called to say that the lines to Blantyre were not functioning. "Jesus! You should have told me earlier." Dan had thundered at the person he couldn't see. The mental image he had of the man was someone very fat with clumsy fingers. He had cursed inaudibly before slamming the receiver down. Today, things have changed, he thought, looking around. The reception is great, casual dress, outdoor atmosphere and all that. What's more, they tell me the lines to Blantyre are working. It's a relief, for I have to talk to Julie tonight. He downed his drink and had the glass filled again. If he was to talk to Julia, he needed all the courage in the world. And only beer could supply it. He was on his sixth or so glass when he noticed a young woman beside him. She was wearing a very nice perfume, the kind of perfume that lingers on long after the user is gone. She was of medium height and very slim. Her white blouse appeared too big for her. The broad smile on her face made her look more beautiful than she really was. "Evening," she said sweetly. "Evening, lady," he replied, returning her smile. Waiting for somebody, she began uncertainly, like a schoolgirl afraid to say the wrong thing in the presence of the teacher. "No. No," he replied hastily. "No. Would I be wrong if I joined you?" she asked, her eyes dancing. "Jesus, can't you see I'm happier alone?" "Yeah, sure, join me," he said, looking at her over the edge of his glass. She reminded him of a Candodo salesgirl who was fired because of overcharging rich customers. That girl had had the same broad smile. "I thought you looked a bit, lost so." "Phew. You're right," he said with a brief chuckle. "I'm lost in thoughts. Would I be stepping beyond limits if I asked what your thoughts were all about?" Now, she's too pushing." "Well," he muttered, wishing she'd go away, "I was thinking about my wife. "Oh, dear, she said, her smile faltering. "Who's thinking of his wife?" someone who had overheard the conversation said, coming closer. He was the participant from Tanzania who had taken up a lot of time in the plenary session that morning, presenting a paper on the role of the traditional herbalist in public health. He had overshot the 10 minutes allocated to him by 50, although the chairperson came butting in repeatedly that there was no need for him to stretch his point that far because everybody had already understood what his paper was all about. But the Tanzanian had gone on talking until the workshop organizers had to step in to say, "This is a workshop, not a talk shop." So could the distinguished speaker wait until participants go into their work groups before taking up the issue again? "Thank you. He's thinking about his wife," the woman said, nodding at Dan. "Lucky man." The Tanzanian boomed. "Why do you say he's lucky?" the woman asked searchingly, wondering whether he was being ironical. "Because he's thinking of his wife." "I'm not." "Why not?" "I'm not married." "I see." She smiled at him broadly, and the next moment the two of them started talking about the workshop proceedings, ignoring Dan, who didn't really care for his thoughts were on Julia. "I've got to speak to her. It will be much easier for me to talk to her on the phone and tell her about Mlo." Then another participant from Tanzania came over to where the three people were standing, although Dan was not paying any attention to the conversation between the other Tanzanian and the woman. "My name is Mokikanga Luisa," the man said to Dan, extending a hand forward. "I'm a medical officer in Dar es Salaam. Pleased to know you." I'm Dan Moyo and I work for the Queen Elizabeth Central Hospital, Blantyre. Great. Dr. Louisa said and, with a short bow, he turned to the woman. And you are? My name is Louisa. The woman shook his hand and said, I'm Priscilla Mzinjiza, from Bulawayo. Delighted, chuckled Dr. Louisa. He was a tall, broad man just like the other Tanzanian, but, unlike him, Dr. Louisa was heavily bearded. You couldn't help liking him, he had that appeal that enabled some people to make friends easily. What did you think of today's session? Dr. Louisa asked Dan, who was again engrossed in his own thoughts. Pardon? Priscilla Mzinjiza looked at Dr. Louisa for a moment, turned to the man who was chatting her up and said, Hey, do you two know each other? East Africans always do, chuckled Dr. Louisa. Dr. Moyes and I have known each other since college days. And what's more, his wife Emily and mine work for the same school as teachers. Priscilla's eyes narrowed. Turning to Dr. Louisa, she said, I didn't know Dr. Moyes was married. Then hurriedly, she added, Excuse me, doctors, let me get myself a drink. The moment she was out of hearing range, Dr. Moyes said, You oaf. Why did you say that? Say what? Asked Dr. Louisa with a mischievous smile. / You didn't have to say that. Say what? That I was married, Ndugu, I was getting somewhere with that lady. Dr. Louisa patted both Dr. Moyo and Dr. Moyes on the shoulders and said, My dear friends, never underrate women. Who does? Frowned Moyes. Most of us men do. If only we can learn that a woman can stand lies, we'll never have broken homes. In spite of himself, Dan decided to pay attention to what the Tanzanian was saying. Women can't stand lies. We must tell the truth and no woman will blame us. If you're married, you are married. That's all. Likewise, if you fool around with some woman, better tell your wife and she'll understand, but if you wait for her to get the news from other sources, you're in trouble. I tell you, women appreciate men who speak the truth. Don't talk as if I'm your nephew, Mwakikanga, the other Tanzanian said. Excuse me, gentlemen, Dan said, I won't be a minute. And he walked away. He placed his empty glass on the table behind which were two smiling barmen who, as you could tell from their eyes, had not been standing there without anything going down their throats. He made his way past the merry participants to his room, his mind still on what Dr. Louisa had just said, we must tell the truth and no woman will blame us. Yes, there was some sense in what the man had said. In fact, wasn't this what Dan himself had been thinking about ever since he got that letter from Tom Nyrenda, to tell Julia nothing but the truth? Sitting on his bed, he picked up the receiver which was on the bedside table next to a very attractive Bible placed there by the management for the convenience of those who liked to read a verse or two before dozing off. He had to talk to her. The Tanzanian was right, we must tell the truth and no woman will blame us. He dialed his house number. There was no reply from the other end. Where was Julia? Or could it be that he was getting the wrong number? Or could it be that she was spending the night at her sister's place? No, she wouldn't do that without telling me. He dialed 0. Operator, he said, thickly. At your service, sir, came a tired voice. Can you dial this number for me? You've a direct line, sir. I know. But can you try it? If you insist, sir. Moments later, the operator was on the line. I'm afraid there's no reply, sir. It's ringing all right, but there's no reply. Thank you. Dan glared at the receiver as if he was about to slap it. For a moment he thought of Trisha. Are you another Trisha, Julie? He asked, imagining her dancing cheek to cheek with some sex maniac at Hotel Chisax. But deep down, he knew Julia was a find. She would never betray him. But why don't you answer the phone, Julie? He dropped the receiver with a sigh of frustration. Time was running out. And his heart was burning to try and get rid of the secret he had kept within himself for so long in a coma of his mind. He still had what that Tanzanian had said, we must tell the truth and no woman will blame us. If he couldn't phone, at least he could write. He pulled his briefcase out from under the bedside table and took out a pen and a writing pad. The pad on the knee, he started writing a letter to Julia. A letter of confession. I must tell the truth and Julie will not blame me. In the letter he unburdened his conscience by stating that he had been foolish not to tell her everything about himself and that the one thing that he had held back was the fact that at one time in his life there had been a girl called Trisha. This Jamaican girl called Trisha, he went on, ended up being pregnant and gave birth to a baby boy, his son. Then kept on writing, telling Julia where he had met Trisha and how he had got on with her. He told her about the job parties he and she used to attend, the music blaring at full blast as if there were no neighbors within a radius of 10 miles. He told her about Trisha's unshaken belief that Emperor Rastafari Haile Selassie was to her what Jesus was to us. He wrote and wrote, pouring out everything from every comma of his heart. He told her of Trisha's weakness for drugs, of her terrible sin with a young white man called Jack Bedford. As he wrote, he had the awful feeling that maybe he was driving nails into his own coffin. He had the feeling that perhaps Julia would walk out on him the way he had walked out on Trisha. I hope you'll understand, Julie, that my love for you is genuine. With Trisha it was an illusion, a mirage, which gave one false hopes. With you, Julie, it's love with a depth, love with a meaning like the love of pigeons. You know why the pigeon is called the bird of love? It's because the moment you take away its mate, the remaining bird doesn't live long, it dies of boredom for life ceases to have a purpose, becomes meaningless like an empty nest. We live for each other, Julie, you and I. I'm sorry for not telling you way back, but I guess I didn't want to lose you, Julie. I had to harbor the secret in order to keep you. About my son-in-law, we'll come to a decision, you and I. Whatever your decision, I'll abide by it. But darling, Julie, don't leave me alone. I need you. I love you.